efficiency in the vineyard, hosted by Sustainable Wine Growing BC. My name is Katie Pease. I'm the program manager for Sustainable Wine Growing BC. And I'd like to start out by just giving a shout out to the Ministry of Agriculture and thanks for the funding for hosting the workshop today. I'd also like to give a thanks to the presenters who are joining us today to share their expertise in the topic area. We are joined by Amy Richards. She is the viticulturist at Phantom Creek. Christopher Mark runs an operation called Ventality, which can help you with all your precision agriculture needs. I'll sum it up that quickly. Andrew Moon is the viticulturist at Tin Horn, working for Andrew Peller, and that makes our panel for today. Each of the speakers will speak for about 20 minutes, and then once done, we'll regroup at the end into a panel and have a Q&A session. I invite you to either put your questions in the chat as we go along, or once we get to the Q&A, you're welcome to raise your hand and ask your question live if you'd prefer to do it that way as well. So without further ado, I am going to dive right in. I'll be giving you just a quick background on SWBC and our approach to water management through the Sustainability Certification Program. And then Amy's going to talk to you about plant physiology. Chris is going to talk about how to plan a precision irrigation system. And then Andrew Moon's going to talk to us about installing and maintaining that system. So SWBC takes a watershed scale approach, kind of looking through that bigger picture lens when we begin to look at, plan for, understand our relationship to water and how we use it in our vineyards. Just a quick background for those of you who don't know, Sustainable Wine Growing BC takes kind of a three-pillar approach to sustainability. And what that means is within our sustainability standards, we are addressing issues of environmental issues, economic issues, and issues of social equity. The way I like to, in a nutshell, kind of describe sustainability, because it is a very comprehensive approach and a comprehensive term. Some people say ill-defined term. However, at SWBC, I just like to correct that by saying we actually have a very well-defined sustainability definition, and we call those our sustainability standards. So I invite you to have a look at those at any time. But in a nutshell, sustainability is a very comprehensive approach. I mentioned the three pillars as I got started, and really what we're doing through all those pillars is kind of taking a look at every aspect of an operation with a very fine-tooth comb, and seeing not only how each of the components of the overall system are working, but then seeing how they're working in relationship to each other. And through that, these practices focus on things like conserving water and energy, maintaining healthy soil, protecting air and water quality, enhancing relations with employees and communities, preserving ecosystems, and then overall kind of improving economic vitality. That economic vitality improvement, for the most part, and especially in vineyards, comes through reducing unnecessary inputs and outputs. We've heard from our members who have certified already a lot of feedback about how going through the sustainability standards really helped them to refine their operations. And really what this does is help them enhance the operations and kind of the outputs that they want to, and then also kind of decrease in areas where they might want to as well, such as costly inputs. So this also helps an operation to kind of minimize risk and liability, you know, through kind of keeping some money in your pocket, one, but then also, you know, we're creating more robust ecosystems so that they are in turn able to withstand a bit more pressure in terms of, you know, the obvious ones we're seeing these days, heat, etc. Smoke, but then also pest pressures and things like that. You know, once a system is refined to maximum operation, it really can become quite resilient. I'll just let you kind of read the rest through there. So that's just a little like 2 cents on SWVC and our approach to sustainability. Again, this is a massive topic and we have lots of information available on it if you would like to explore it further. For today's topic, I wanted to share with you, outlined here are the vineyard goals outlined in our vineyard standards. So each of these 6 chapters focuses on a specific area, and you can see that 2 out of 6, those that are bolded, focus on water management. So SWVC places a very high priority on water management as part of the Sustainable Wine Growing Program. First, as I mentioned, by taking a broad look at the watershed within which you operate and implementing kind of conservation measures there where appropriate, and then drilling all the way down into optimizing irrigation within your own operation as well. So I'll apologize in advance. My next few slides are very text heavy, but there's only a few, and then we'll wrap it up and send it over to Amy so we can really get started with the content of today's program. Within our standards, we have them organized by goals, which I've already mentioned. I just showed you on the last slide, some expected outcomes, and then in order to meet those expected outcomes, we outline criteria. These criteria are what members must meet in order to certify their vineyard and or winery. So for the watershed management goal area, I wanted to just share with you what the expected outcomes are. I mentioned already that as part of the program, it's necessary to identify your water sources and bodies in order to implement protection measures where relevant. Really, not everybody is right on a water body. We take measures to control erosion, to keep soil in place and avoid sediment from running down into waterways. We work to protect and restore waterways, wetlands, and riparian buffers. We conserve and enhance biodiversity. And as part of an overall vineyard management plan that is required for certification, a conservation plan is developed. Focusing on irrigation optimization, this goal area has only one expected outcome, which is rare for these goals or goal areas, but it is that irrigation systems are managed to meet the grapevine needs, ensure fruit quality, and optimize the use of labor and reduce the overall use of water within the vineyard. I went ahead within this irrigation optimization example and highlighted here the essential criteria within this goal area. The essential criteria are what members would need to meet in order to certify in a first year, for instance. So these are the criteria: installing backflow prevention devices, testing irrigation distribution uniformity, and then analyzing those results to sort of make changes within your system where needed and necessary. Identifying and delineating irrigation management zones, testing irrigation water, and then of course analyzing the results of those water tests in order to, again, sort of identify any problems and then outline their respective management solutions. As part of the program, you monitor and measure water use, use low volume irrigation, such as drip or micro sprinklers, and perform and document maintenance activities for all irrigation and water distribution systems. So some of these things are going to be talked about as well by our presenters today, but I just wanted to sort of share them with you so that you have an understanding of the approach of SWBC and to certifying, and, you know, just very briefly here what that might entail, what that does entail, I should say. And I'm going to come back to this slide at the end, but we have lots of resources available for you on the SWBC website. We hope, of course, that you may be interested in certifying your operation through the SWBC certification program, but if not, all of our resources are still available to you. You can get online, you can self-assess your operation, you can use the tools to refine your systems and approaches. So check out our resources section. There you can download the Vineyard Standard, you can download our Vineyard Management Plan template, a water use tracking tool, a maintenance tracking tool, et cetera, et cetera. And just before I finish my presentation, I couldn't leave without giving a shout out to our leaders in the field who have certified with us through our first year at SWBC. So thanks to all these vineyards and wineries who are leading the charge with sustainability certification here in BC. And with that, I'm going to stop my share. And we're going to begin to go through the presentations of each of our presenters today. We won't plan to have a break between the presentations. So as one person finishes, the next will just come up and begin their presentation. And then again, we'll regroup at the end of all the presentations, and we'll have an opportunity to really kind of get into a discussion about this topic. You'll have plenty of time and opportunity to ask questions, and we really hope you will engage and bring us some stumpers. Let's see how we go. All right, Amy, please, over to you.
Thanks very much, Katie. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. We had a few issues with my audio a little earlier on, and I really didn't want to be that person on Zoom that we've all experienced for the last couple of years. So today I'm going to be spending 20 minutes talking about water, soil and the vine, really just talking about how water relations impact vine physiology throughout the season. Sorry, I'm just waiting for my slides to, there we go. I hope you can all see that slide change. So water is an essential chemical substance for photosynthesis, which we know is, you know, the process where green plant tissue uses sunlight and carbon dioxide to produce carbohydrates. It's also important for biochemical reactions with the plant, transportation of carbohydrates, hormones, macronutrients and micronutrients around the vine, and protection from heat stress through evaporative cooling. Okay, so the vine sources its water from the soil through its roots, and then that water is moved through the xylem to other parts of the vine. Now, this liquid water in the vine is regarded as sort of a continuous stream in the xylem from the soil right through to the leaf and the leaf cells and out into the atmosphere. And it's sort of the cohesive properties of water that hold this stream together. So the low water potential of the atmosphere really drives that movement of water through the vine from the soil, which has very high water potential normally when the soil is well irrigated, right through the vine into the atmosphere, which has very low water potential. So it's this sort of difference in water potentials that drive that gradient and create the flow from soil right through the vine and into the atmosphere. This movement of water from the soil through the vine and out through into the atmosphere is called transpiration. Now, water moves from the vine into the atmosphere through very small pores called stomata, which are located on the underside of the leaf. Stomata are kind of the vine's control centre. So not only do they regulate that flow of water, they are also the site for gas exchange. So for CO2 coming in and oxygen going out. So for photosynthesis, and they also help regulate the vine's temperature through evaporative cooling. So they're an absolutely critical component in the vine's function and structure. So that rate of water movement through the vine, the transpiration rate, is affected by 3 different factors. The first is, of course, the availability and the accessibility of water in the soil. If there's plenty of water in the soil, then the vine's going to draw as much as it needs to create that flow through the vine. If the soil water is limited, if we're between irrigations or there's drought, not enough water's been applied, then that transpiration rate is going to be limited just merely through lack of supply. The transpiration rate is also determined by the atmosphere. So the atmospheric conditions determine how the water potential is outside of the leaf, and therefore that gradient that creates the water flow. So when we have cool, wet conditions, the gradient is small and the transpiration rate is low. Whereas when we have those hot, dry conditions like we have during heat waves and in summer, there's a really large gradient and therefore a high rate of flow or a high transpiration rate. And the third really critical factor in that transpiration rate is the stomata themselves. So they create the vine's ability to actually regulate water movement through the vine, out from the soil through to the atmosphere. And these stomata are pretty fantastic in that they can actually open and close to regulate the flow or the loss of water through vine leaves. So through the soil, out through the leaf surface. Under good conditions, where there's plenty of moisture available in soil, then they are completely open and they allow that flow of water through the vine and out through transpiration, and also the intake of carbon dioxide for photosynthesis and exchange of oxygen for respiration. And you can see in my little photo that I have there down the bottom, on the right-hand side, you've got a nice open stomata. So we'd assume there that the conditions are really good, the vine's not under any stress, and the water's able to flow through the soil, out through the leaf surface and into the atmosphere. And there's that full gas exchange and the vine is functioning optimally. However, under really hot, dry conditions and where the soil water is limited, so you have water stress, then the vine will actually partially or fully close the stomata, to conserve their water. And you can see there on the left-hand side of that picture, that stomata is almost fully closed, which indicates that the vine is under stress and trying to conserve water. Now, while this reaction is really effective and creates a great sort of drought tolerance for the vine, it conserves water, but there are trade-offs. So stomatal closure leads to reduced gas exchange. So there's reduced photosynthesis, reduced carbohydrate creation, and a loss in evaporative cooling. So while there's sort of that trade-off, the vine's really, really good at being able to conserve its water when it needs to, but there are detrimental effects to growth and productivity when it does that. And the actual effect on vine growth and development through water stress and its response really depends on the intensity and the duration of that water stress, or unfavourable conditions, and the phenological stage of the vine. And I'm just going to kind of go through those key stages and talk about what the impacts are and how we can manage and mitigate them. So from the stage of bud burst right through until set is a pretty critical stage in establishing the canopy size and determining the yield for the season. So it's during this period that we have very rapid vegetative growth, shoots, leaves, and tendrils are all rapidly expanding. And you know that rapid expansion during this period really kind of guarantees the development of an adequate canopy to be able to sustain production and ripen the amount of fruit that we need for the season. But moderate stress during this really, really critical stage where we're establishing the canopy and the yield can result from uneven bud burst at the beginning of the season, slower vegetative growth, leading to reduced amount of a number of shoots or smaller shoots, reduced amount of leaves and tendrils. Moderate to severe stress is going to result in a drying and eventually desiccation of the growing tip and the tendrils, and eventually just a complete cessation in shoot growth. And in that case, then there's going to be insufficient canopy to ripen fruit. If we get water stress around flowering, then regardless of whether we're able to, with the vine trying to draw adequate water, if there is insufficient water for those flowering, for the flowers, it can result in uneven flowers and eventually poor set. So in an increased number of hens and chicks and shot berries. And this is of course going to result in a reduction in yield through poor set and lower bunch weights. So the key thing here is in this really critical period, always trying to establish a canopy of really avoiding any water stress during this period to make sure that we have full canopy establishment, optimum flower retention, and really good fruit set. So our next key stage is between veraison and harvest. So water stress from veraison to harvest is also going to influence the growing canopy. This is really the first period of berry development, and any stress during this period is going to result in a reduction in berry size and therefore a final yield. But this is a key stage for us as viticulturists, because by controlling, we can actually control canopy growth here. We can use that stress response of the vine. Because water stress during this stage is going to slow vegetative growth, just like it would between bud burst and set. And that moderate to severe stress, if the vine experiences that, is going to result in a cessation in shoot growth. But this might be something that we actually want during this period. This is the first period of berry development, and any stress here is going to result in a reduction in berry cell division if it occurs in those first 3 weeks of berry development, and then eventually a reduction in berry expansion. But a controlled moderate stress here, something like a regulated deficit irrigation, could be applied to deliberately reduce vegetative growth, control berry size, and increase periderm development, so lignification and shoots transitioning from being shoots to canes. Now, by controlling that canopy growth, by manipulating the vine's response to mild stress, it's a cheap and effective way to control the canopy microclimate. And the only labour requirement here is the person needed to turn on and off the valves. Controlling canopy growth after set through mild water stress can also lead to fewer lateral shoots, a more open canopy, so better spray penetration, and better light and air movement through the canopy. But of course, we want to avoid severe stress that's going to lead to defoliation and severely limit berry size and therefore yield, and probably affect quality too, and also bud fruitfulness in the following season. So from veraison to harvest is the period where berries are going to grow, soften, change colour and accumulate sugar, metabolize acid, and develop tannin and aroma compounds. So any stress at this stage is going to reduce berry size, impede and therefore delay berry ripening, which is not something that we want when we're working with reds here in the Okanagan or Similkameen valleys, and impact the tannin and flavour profile. My experience, probably more so in South Australia and during periods of severe drought, is that that wines made from highly water-stressed fruit will often have a pretty simple cooked and confectionery flavour and aroma profile, and that's something we want to avoid. So this is the period where we want to provide the vine with just the right amount of water it needs for optimal photosynthesis and transpiration. And transpiration here is really critical by giving the vine enough water to have uninterrupted water flow through the vine, because it's often at this stage that we have, well, except for of course last year, that we experience heat waves and a lot of heat and long durations of heat. So it's important during those conditions, when that atmosphere of having hot, dry, windy conditions causes transpiration rate to increase, that we want to make sure that the vine has enough water to keep those stomata open and enable that evaporative cooling to occur in the leaf and the fruit. So cooling the surface and making sure that we're preventing any sunburn. And then finally, the post-harvest period. So during this period, the leaves are going to continue to function right up until leaf fall. And the vine's going to carry out that critical function or critical functions of cold acclimation and carbohydrate storage, ready for the upcoming winter, and then of course bud burst in the following season before it goes into dormancy. So any water stress during this period is going to impede that late season leaf function, limit the storage of carbohydrate reserves that we want for next year and to get through the winter, and then possibly impact bud burst and early growth in the spring of the following season. This is particularly important in young vines. So at this stage, we want to avoid any water stress during the post-harvest period, but of course not apply enough water or over-irrigate to the point where we have that regrowth of shoots. So I'm happy to, Katie, answer any questions or leave those until the end.
Yeah, if we could leave questions to the end, I think that would be great. We'll just go ahead and bring in Christopher next for his presentation. Thank you very much, Amy.
Thank you.
Are we good? Everyone can see that? Can you give me, yeah, perfect. Thanks, Andrew. So yeah, my name's Chris, for those that don't know me, with a company called Vitality, and we're going to talk a bit about precision irrigation system planning. And just before I launch into it, I'm going to throw a lot at you just to give you a bit of expectations for this presentation, because to talk about a lot of these mechanisms, you know, we really have to go into a lot of specificity. So I'm not expecting you to understand everything or to, you know, be able to remember, because it's going to be a lot of detail. What I want you to get out of this presentation is a general overview. So when you go and you look at, you know, a capitance or a TDR soil moisture probe, you at least have some concept of what they are or what your other options are. How you can kind of think about in a big picture with precision irrigation. So again, there's going to be a lot of information. I'm not expecting you to remember all of this. I want to give you that piece that sets the seed, so you have an idea of what to look for when you're trying to address some of the questions I think that precision irrigation can really answer. And here's what we'll cover. So just kind of a quick explanation of what it is, why it matters. We'll talk about some kind of broad irrigation scheduling issues, benefits, challenges. Amy covered some of that, so I'll blow through some of that pretty quickly. And then we'll talk about tools, and that's where we'll spend a good amount of our time. So what is precision irrigation? And what it really is at its most fundamental level is ensuring you get what water you need, where you need it. as we think of where even just moving from an overhead to a drip irrigation system, what you're doing is you're taking water that is very inefficient and you're making it more efficient. Well, as tools continue to develop, as our knowledge and research continues to develop, we are becoming more and more focused on being able to put the water precisely where it's needed. And so that's what this is about. It's about water savings, it's about labor savings, financial savings, all of this for a better fruit, for better vine, etc. Okay, so why should you care? And I think there are kind of three. Obviously, sustainability, that's a lot of what we're talking about here today. I think one of the big things we really talk about a lot with our clients is more regulations are absolutely coming. Even with like the well water regulation or registering, like there's a lot of frustration, I know, with the government there. Just what we're seeing with heat waves and our actual used water, and I think how we've really overused water, that's coming to an end, absolutely. And so I think preparing for that, but I think there's lots more positive reasons to care, and I think that's the impact that precision has on the quality of your vineyard winemaking operation, and including financial. Typically what we'll see in papers, people that have switched to precision systems, savings easily of 30 to 50%. I was actually just listening to an interview the other day. They were saying compared to a control site they managed in a standard way, they reduced irrigation by 80%, also by including sheep, which was kind of interesting. But the point is that the savings can be quite significant and are consistently fairly significant as we move towards more precise irrigation. I'm just going to burn through these and don't need to. The point is that irrigation, obviously, and Amy's covered a lot of this, has an impact on a lot of things. And there are significant benefits to particularly targeted irrigation. So a lot of what we see is that as irrigation is more targeted and more intentional, it improves plant health and it leads to higher. Similarly with climate change, it's leading to vines that can more fight the droughts, the frost, especially the heat waves that we need. And a lot of that has to do with those xylem vessels. As we see some level of control, which often means a level of like a minor deficit to moderate deficit, you're going to see much more resilient xylem vessels, which play a huge role in how that plant adapts and is able to handle stresses, and not just heat stress, not just water stress, disease, all kinds of different stressors. So, and then here's just, again, just very quickly, potential issues you're going to see with when irrigation is not targeted. And one of the things I would say is this is actually kind of where we've arrived at as a company with our own experiences. Irrigation is probably the #1 issue we see working with vineyards pretty comfortably. I would say that is, that is consistently what we're encountering, is that more than any other kind of nutrient disease, anything else, irrigation issues, over irrigation, under irrigation. And speaking of over irrigation, again, I'm just kind of throwing this. The point is there's a lot of problems with over irrigation. I should have taken a photo. There's one vineyard in the area, over irrigation, they blew out. They just had a big blowout. And I'm sure some of you have encountered, I know some of you have encountered that with maybe your own vineyard, other vineyards, where you over irrigate and then the subsoil structure collapses and you have a slide, even just a minor slide. So again, the costs of over irrigation are not just financial, but they run the gamut of everything. And obviously, as we're talking about sustainability, that's a big part as well. Now, before we get into some of the specifics, I want to talk briefly about tech, because we're going to be talking about a lot of technology. And like, I get that tech exhaustion exists and it is real. And a lot of that, first of all, is that people overpromise. And the beauty is that, we fly a lot of drones, and I've been following drones for a long time. And I can tell you, when they first started becoming popular about 15 years ago, there were all kinds of promises made that really only now are actually starting to be delivered in. So if you were a farm investing 10 years ago, 12 years ago, you didn't see that return. The research wasn't there, the tech wasn't there. And so I want to acknowledge that even though we're talking about technology, that that is a legitimate experience and feeling to have, and maybe not just with your farm, maybe in your own personal life. I think we need to be careful that the other thing we do see is that people will use tech for like a year or two. So you might use a moisture sensor for just 1 or 2 years and not fully use it, not follow the protocols, maybe not have it installed properly, and that will affect the results that you see. So the flip side is we do need to be careful with making sure that if we are wanting to test and investigate, that we actually understand and use the technology appropriately, or else we won't see any benefit. And just for time, I'm going to skip. I was going to talk a little bit about Martin Heidegger, but I'm realizing now I'm definitely going to run out of time. The point is that how I also am going to be talking about, and how I want you to think about this technology, is it's not a replacement. I think a lot of technology is sold as it's going to replace a lot of you as the winemaker, as the vineyard owner, as the vineyard manager, as the hand in the vineyard. And what I want to talk about is technology as an extension. It is not a replacement, it's a hammer. It makes your life easier. The point is not to then automate everything so you don't have to use your expertise, develop your expertise, make decisions. The point is that it is going to help you make better decisions. It is going to make you better at your job, not replace you at your job. So I'm going to burn through this part just because Amy covered a lot of it. There are lots of factors affecting types of irrigation. So I want to get a little bit, just looking at time, making sure we talk a lot about the tech. One thing I did want to talk about quickly was, I think the big picture of precision irrigation is not just putting water where we want it, is also understanding plant physiology, which again, Amy covered, and big picture when we want to put water where we want it. And the big one I really want to encourage is, again, this is very crude. I think the data and research backs up these points, which is why I've included them, but this is a very crude point, and there's still going to be some controversy. Everyone on here is not going to agree with all of this, but I think the big one I would push and argue for is that irrigation post-veraison, because of the impact it makes on the plant for the rest of the year. And I think there's tons of data and research on the benefits, and this was a change from, say, 15, 20 years ago. So that is just, again, don't over-irrigate. And when we're talking about deficit, we're talking about red varieties, almost always, so factor that in as well. But that post-veraison irrigation is setting you up for success next year, and you're not going to have an impact on the berry because that phloem flow shuts down. You get a tiny bit of backflow from the xylem, but it really is not having an impact. So once you're in or through veraison, you're not going to harm the quality of your berry. So just, again, that would be one strong encouragement I would make is that's, as Amy talked about as well, not hitting deficit then. And this is just from Marcus Keller and his updated, a lot of what they're seeing in terms of even significant deficits. So again, this I think is still an issue that's complicated and we're still kind of investigating, but I'll just quickly read this. Irrigation replacing as little of 30% of evapotranspiration, either before or after veraison, did not lead to a further decrease in shoot growth and berry size, and had only 60% replacement level. A slight increase in pH and decrease in acidity and color in some years may be the small price to pay for imposing relatively severe water deficit before veraison. Withholding water too early before fruit set, however, may reduce the vine's yield potential. And I think this accords exactly with what Amy was saying. And again, this is where the big picture of how we think about precision irrigation is knowing when to water, when not to water. And so I think post-veraison, and then some of what Keller's talking about here, before veraison, and they tested even pretty severe water deficits at 30%, and they saw good results. I'm not telling you to do that, but just something to consider at that big picture level. And I think again, a bit of that question of why can't we just have the same schedule? Why do we even need to, even focus on, can't we just take that big picture or our own schedule we figured out, our own familiarity? And I think it just changes too much. I think, I love this Nicola Mastro's quote, without measurement, there is no management. And as in a year, like if you're watering this year, like you did last year, you're going to be in trouble. And you might luck out, and things like attention and managing this information is so critical because it's going to lead you to all these benefits in terms of financial savings, sustainability, labor savings, better quality fruit, etc. One last big picture comment is just factor in how your irrigation system affects the vine growth, root growth, its reaction to irrigation. I'm not going to get into this, but just knowing that different systems are going to produce different reactions to irrigation. So keeping that in mind. So, okay, now we were like, we want to investigate, we want to know how does the plant interact? How can we be more precise with the irrigation? When do we water? When do we not water? And I think the first one, the super low tech option, is just visual observations. And so a lot of that is monitoring shoot growth. So it's looking at, I mean, if a plant is pushing and growing, it is likely in general not, I'm making a very crude comment here, so please acknowledge that, but is likely not very stressed. If especially at the secondary meristem, because it is not pushing. And so you can get out, you can get a ruler at a it's costs you nothing and just be in the vineyard. And this is a good way to tell immediately how stressed is the plant. Also, if again, this is dead simple, but if you want to assess how is my soil doing, you can just take a shovel out, right? And see how wet is the soil, try and get down to, I mean, you know, we want to get to root depth in a lot of cases. Obviously, that's going to be completely impossible if you've got older vines that are getting down to 1 meter, 2 meters plus. But even we have so many roots in that upper soil layer, just investigating that, giving it a squeeze and getting a feel and learning even on your own site and with your own type of soil, what that looks like in terms of how moist is the soil, how dry are we getting, what is our soil like. And I think, again, the plant is the best way to tell. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a moment. So just taking that. Now, the problem with visual checks is that the plant, when it's reacting to stress, there are multiple stressors. So when we say water stress, a lot of the times when you're looking and you're like, okay, the plant is turning away, these are some, we're seeing signs of water stress. What you're really seeing in most cases is just general signs of stress, unless it gets so severe that you're seeing leaf defoliation, you're seeing significant color change, depending on what the disease or nutrient deficiency, whatever, you're seeing specific signs. So you've gotten so severe, you're not seeing a specific sign. But early on, most stresses, not all, but most are going to present in the same way. So you may be looking and thinking of a water stress issue, but it might be a reaction to wind. It might be ESCA. It might be the fact that you're actually having a nutrient issue. And this will often present even in decreased plant vine water status, because it's those solutes, like Amy talked about, that water potential through the vine, right? It's the water is moving from areas of high to low potential in the soil, moving through the vine to low potential out into the atmosphere. Is that solutes create areas of low potential to pull that water. And so if you're having a nutrient deficiency, you can actually show as water stress. It can actually be a lower water content, but not because there's not enough water for the plant, but because the plant has the nutrient challenges. It needs to be moving through the vineyard, walking, observing, experiencing what's happening. But we also need to be careful that we don't over prescribe, or we think we can figure out just based on visual observation everything that's happening, because we know we can't. It's just not possible. So how else can we look? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go from relatively simple to more complicated systems. I think the best system in terms of probably the gold standard right now, or it is the gold standard, is pressure chambers. And so what that's doing is you're putting the leaf in the pressure chamber there, and measuring what the water potential in that leaf is. And there are 3 ways to do this. The most common, which probably those of you who've used it, this is the way almost everyone is doing it because it's the easiest. It's midday. So it's just that the idea being that that's your leaf water potential. That's simple of where the plant is at that moment. The disadvantage is it's very contextual to that moment. It's hard, various factors there are many variables that can affect it in the moment. You then have pre-dawn concept there is that it gives you a concept where the soil should have recharged. And so the water potential should tell you what is in the soil, what water's in the soil available to the plant. And then the last one is stem leaf water potential. That's where you're putting in a bag. Mostly researchers are doing that. I think there's some benefit, but I'm going to leave that one alone. So if you're using a pressure chamber, usually you're going to be doing midday leaf water potential, but just keep in mind a lot of variables to affect that. So let's talk about, and the nice thing about the pressure chamber is it's a direct measure for the plant. You're getting a direct picture of what the plant's vine water status is, because that's what we care about. At the end of the day, if the plant has enough water in it, has enough water within its structures, you don't actually care if there's no water in the soil. I mean, you'll care eventually if the plant doesn't have it, but it's what matters is what's in the plant. And so indirect measures like soil, we have to be careful, because just because the soil is high or low in terms of its water, available water at that point, does not mean the plant is stressed or not stressed, because yeah, we'll move on and talk about that a little bit. So one of the things when you're looking at soil moisture sensors, you have to factor your specific soil. You can send this into a lab. You can just dig down where you're going to put your probe. When you're putting your probe in, you can run and do it, because guess what? What your water holding capacity, what you're seeing with your moisture curve, right, in sand is going to be very different than clay. And so this is just one of the critical things. You need to send that into a lab or have someone assess what is your texture class, because that's going to affect. And this is just Scott Smith. Big thanks to him. Just sent in some, if you, and I'm happy, actually, if you want this data, I asked it from Scott. I probably shouldn't share it without his permission, but you'll see there some typical water capacity, water data for common Okanagan Valley soils. So again, this is kind of the data you need to figure out. A lab can do it. A consultant obviously can help you do it. You can do it, again, you can totally do it by yourself to figure out what is the actual capacity of my soil. Because if you just look at the graph and you haven't done this, the data, there's huge problems with the data, because you don't actually yet contextualize it to what your soil can actually hold. And so again, this is a critical step if you're using soil moisture probes. And just again, this is where we want to be at, is we want to be somewhere between field capacity and wilting point. So again, if we bounce back, that's in the middle of that gray curve there, the water available to plants, that's where we want to be in. And this kind of gives you an idea of how much wiggle room you have based on different types of soil structure. So saturation is bad. So you want to put in a soil moisture sensor. There's two types. You have volumetric, which just measures the total soil moisture volume. And then you have tension, which are also called matrix potential. And the idea is how much can it pull, how hard is it to pull water off of the soil profile, off the soil itself. And so these are common. Volumetric is the most common, right? TDR, some of you probably have used TDR. They're going, I think Grow Point right now is the only one that's kind of actually pushed. They're in Vancouver Island. They've actually made some interesting advances on TDR, but other than them, everyone's moving away from it, because right now, if you're looking for a soil moisture probe, this is almost for sure what you're going to be looking for. And again, both of these sensors are volumetric. They're telling you how much soil is in a given volume. Again, the second type of soil is where it's measuring tension. The beauty is you don't need to actually do that, the soil curve, because it is irrespective, because this tension, it's telling you what you already need to know in terms of the soil content. The one challenge is that I would say they're not quite there yet in general, but this might be the future of soil moisture sensors. And that's a Meter group has a nice sensor. But again, in wet soil and clay, you're going to have a bit more problems. So here's some just quick tips and tricks. I think one of the really important ones is making sure you're getting that sensor to root depth, and also mapping your soil. I think having some knowledge, doing some soil pits so that you can figure out what is the actual soil structure, because if your vineyard is very heterogeneous, and you put your soil sensors in the wrong spot, again, is maintenance, and that's why we recommend, I think in general, the capacitance sensors. And on this note, Sarah, who works with us, is on the call. She did a lot of work putting together this. She's done a lot of digging in sensors, and so I would highly recommend you reach out to her, sarah@ventali.com, if you have questions about different types of sensors, because she knows this better than I, and she's done a lot of digging and talking to people on what's working with different types of sensors. How am I doing for time, Katie? I forgot to check when I started.
You're doing okay. Amy actually took a little shorter time, so we can give you just a little bit extra.
So I get to blather on, right? Okay, perfect. Thanks, Amy. Okay, so we're kind of coming to the end. So again, we're moving from less complex to more complex. So we've talked about pressure bombs, which is giving us a concept of plant water status. We've talked about soil moisture, now EC. So this is something I absolutely love. I think this is absolutely critical. I'm not going to a lot of the science What this does is this allows you to figure out what is there down to roughly, depends on the whether you're using the Veris or the EM38, roughly 1.5 meters, and the relative soil texture of your site. So again, at this site, this is a heat map. Those pinks are clay, and when we dug our soil pits, they were it was like almost potter's clay. Like you almost could go to your potting studio, make a nice vase or something from that. It was that thick, but it was not immediately like that. If you just had taken a shovel, you would have thought, oh, we've kind of got a bit more of a kind of a loam or something here, which is what you had in the not clay area, being a little cheeky. But this, again, gives you an idea of guess where you want to put your soil moisture sensors. You want to make sure you have one in at least each of those sites. And here's another example. Again, this picture is down at 2 meters in a Soyuz Oliver sand. And you'll notice, again, we have quite a bit of root mass way down in areas that obviously are having oxygen issues. But why? Because it's chasing moisture. And so again, knowing and where that is sand, but we see in that specific site when we get into soil that we've got more relative clay, root structure, there's water, et cetera, in those areas. And that's why I think some sort of subsoil mapping can be very important to actually figure out what to do and then how you irrigate, because obviously how you're going to irrigate, these two areas is going to be very different, because you effectively have a loam in the top left, putting it crudely, and a clay in the bottom right. And so knowing that really, again, allows you to adjust your irrigation system. Again, then you get in. And I think this is something that you don't even need to do this. I obviously recommend the subsoil mapping, but you want to save costs. You want to do this yourself. You can go rent one of those little excavators, diggers, and just go dig some soil pits. Super cheap. It's going to cost you a few $100 at most, and actually investigate. And you're going to see, again, when you look at that site on the left, guess what? All of a sudden we start to see a change in soil structure, and there are roots down there. So when you're trying to understand what's happening in your vineyard, absolutely critical. Another option, which has really come on last few years, is in terms of evaluating when and why and where to irrigate, is another form of remote sensing, is UAV or satellite, both kind of NDVI type algorithms, and then thermal. And I think one of the interesting things we're going to see more of is thermal that is actually just vine facing. So you just set up an inexpensive camera and you just leave it, and it takes a photo every so once in a while. And from that, it can then capture what your vine status is. It's calibrated, and then it's easy to do. And then you don't have to lug around your pressure bomb all the time. You calibrate with the pressure bomb. Once it's calibrated, you're good to go. And you don't need to be doing that all the time or getting up before dawn if that's your thing. And these are coming on. And this is, again, I think one of the areas in the future we're really going to see more potential. The last one, which in some ways is simple because most of you have weather stations, but is modeling. And obviously using ET, you have the right service, can be very affordable and can be very effective if it's properly calibrated. One of the things, if you're using ET data, is you have to make sure it's calibrated to your site. And also, I just always encourage, be careful, you have to check its calibration fairly with some degree of regularity, because of course, if you look at this photo, a weather station that is that far above your canopy in one or two areas of your vineyard, well, guess what? Your canopy can be radically different. If you have a thin canopy, it might be very similar, but if your canopy has any growth or topography or any other factors, different slopes, that model can only apply to certain areas. And again, I think this is pretty consistently seen in the research, where ET models can be off by, sometimes they can be quite accurate and sometimes they can be off by quite a bit. So I would just, if you're thinking about ET modeling, I would factor that in. The last one that I'm going to talk about is the atmometers. I just want to make you aware of these. Effectively, what this does is you put it at canopy height and it mimics leaf transpiration accurately. It requires almost no maintenance. You just have to refill it with water 2 or 3 times a year. And it actually does a really good job. That cap at the top mimics leaf, is it designed to mimic a leaf surface area, so that as wind and heat and other things hit it, it will transpire at a rate that is very close to what the leaf is actually doing, and this would get you away with the issues from ET modeling. Currently, they're not accessible. We're working on seeing if we can make this a bit more accessible, but I'm just telling you, this is something to watch. The Summerlin Research Center has done great work with this, and they've found reductions of 50% quite easily without requiring anything complicated from growers. So this can become more accessible, and if we start to see more data on this, this is something to pay attention to. There are other options. I'm not going to talk about these. These are just more complicated and a bit more controversial. Some of them complicated, some of them controversial, some of them expensive. So, you know, there are other things to help you determine when to irrigate, but I find these are much less accessible. So now you know when to irrigate at a broad level. You've kind of picked your items, and now you're gathering the data. Now, this next step in terms of precision irrigation is actually it's automation, it's valves, it's all these components to actually adjust your irrigation system. I'm not going to talk much about this because Andrew is going to be dealing with this in much more detail. I just want to point out a few options in terms of actual implementation to actually be more precise. And one of the crude things you can really do is, even with your drip system, is just put more emitters. So if you know you have an area you need to water more, it's just more emitters along your drip line, or in some cases it's doubling back or running a second line. Like, there are lots of, these are much more high-tech options, but getting to that low tech, there are many things you can do just to, without requiring anything more from you, that you can allow yourself to be a bit more precise, because you can run some lines that just have emitters over certain areas without getting too expensive. So there's still a lot of unanswered questions. I'm not going to talk about this right now. You know, we have concern with soil moisture sensors. A lot of this modeling data, even I think rootstocks, I have not been satisfied with the research I've read in terms of how we understand how we know they affect irrigation, but we don't have great answers, I think, on that yet. And even the fund consensus. So this is not to be discouraging. This is just to say, also, there are lots of gaps in what we know still. And part of the fun is there always will be. So what's coming? I think the big thing is just things that are more user-friendly. So I think as you're looking at these different options, part of what we're presenting, even in terms of the soil moisture sensors, is you're going to see more user-friendly, easier to use soil moisture sensors. The old TDR sensors were a pain. They're always a hassle. They broke, etc. And now we're starting to see new communication platforms, you know, much more well-presented data. And so I think that's really exciting. And I think the biggest thing is data that is going to be contextual to your site. This is something I talk about a lot, but PDL data, for example, not that useful unless you're comparing it year on year. And again, much of this data too, just a soil moisture curve isn't useful unless you have been able to calibrate it to your site. So context-driven solutions, I think, are what really excite me. If you're looking to read a bit more about some of this in a really accessible way, these papers are a few pages. They're not very technical at all. These are two I would recommend that just give a good overview of both the tools and then some of the irrigation philosophies. Shoot me an email if you can't find them, or you just too lazy, at chris@ventali.com. I'll send you these papers. I just think this is good if you just want to spend 20 minutes, 30 minutes and kind of look through some of what I talked about, maybe in a bit more detail. These are two excellent papers. And finally, as I wrap up here, and again, I know it's been a lot, is how do we start? And I think one of the big things is keeping a record and being organized. None of this works if it just is kind of left willy-nilly. And I think also at your vineyard, farm, having someone in charge of starting to implement, like, again, this is a lot of information. Some of you, this is going to be old hat to you, but for some of you, this is, I've thrown a lot at you. And in that case, just picking one thing and starting with it and making sure there's someone who's responsible for it, right? At the end of the day, this comes back to people. And I think, you know, organization. So, and, you know, I'm a new father for a month now, and I can tell you that a schedule, as, you know, this is my parenting advice to all of you, is a schedule and organization is critical. In, and I feel like I can give advice. So obviously I'm excited to answer questions and hear what Andrew has to say. You can contact Sarah or I. There's our information. And then also just a special thanks to Scott and then Sean, Scott Smith, and then Sean over at the Summerlin Research Center. They definitely have been a big help in kind of, continuing to dialogue about this kind of stuff. And with that, I will stop and leave it for Andrew.
Right, can everybody hear me? And then can everybody see my screen? Talking about technical things, I think I've used Zoom for a couple of years and I still don't know what I'm doing, so it's okay. Yeah, so today I was looking at the agenda and I didn't know, we got the cart before the horse or the horse before the cart. We can construct a vineyard, and then, Amy and Christopher have done a great job in explaining what you can do with the irrigation systems. But do you say that after you build it or you're in an existing vineyard? What I'm going to talk about today, and you can talk about any number of these components for hours, we're going to be talking about construction and maintenance of an irrigation system. Now, I've been doing this for a number of years, and I did it both in Australia and in Canada. I've built multiple vineyards. It's a scary prospect for someone new to come to a blank bit of ground and then start to try to work out what they're going to do. What I'm going to try to do today is similar to Christopher. I can't go into too much detail, but I'm going to give you a little bit of an idea and a guideline of how to actually start thinking about how to construct a irrigation system. Saying that, we went a little bit into the design and planning phase. Now that's another whole thing about construction. So there's a whole part about design and planning. Now what I can say is you could either do this stuff yourself, but I would highly recommend, if you haven't done any of this kind of irrigation work, if you're not a engineer or hydraulic engineer, there's a number of companies around that will help you with irrigation design and the planning part. The irrigation design is very important. If you screw this up, it's going to cost you a lot of money. Some figures floating around at the moment is, putting in an irrigation system just on drip and the materials alone, minus the pump gear, is around $3,500 an acre. Now, if you double that up with overhead irrigation, you're talking $7,000 an acre. And this is not the install. This is just the materials. So you have to be very certain about what you're going to do with your land. Obviously, it's been a very expensive purchase or an upgrade to your existing irrigation system. So one of the best things to do, I'd love to see the pictures about soil pits, things like that was the initial part in the vineyard. That's one of the most important things to do, is that you understand what kind of soil type you have. In this valley, up north around the lakes, you see a bit more clay, generally down south, a lot of sand. That makes a big difference on irrigation design. The output, you've got two choices here. You're probably going to do, I'd say two choices. There are more, but there's drip and there's overhead. There are micro sprinklers, etc., but that brings in another whole scope of about filtration. So we're gonna just have a look at drip and overhead to start with. So roughly about the same cost to put in. Depending on your soil type of what you want to do, obviously overhead irrigation is kind of old school. I'm telling you now that not many people around the world use it anymore. That's because of the cost of water. It's very inefficient. I know this is going to start something. There's a kind of a thing around here where people use overhead irrigation to cool their vineyards down. That's the biggest lot of rubbish I've ever heard in my life. But it's if you see things in Israel, Australia, California, South Africa, where drip irrigation is prevalent, we've got way hotter climates than what's in Canada, and no one uses overhead irrigation. So mainly because of the cost. So if you're using overhead irrigation, if you're going to put it into your vineyard, there are a couple of advantages that, and mainly and this is very important about sustainability, especially on the sands. It's very good to stop soil erosion and help to develop cover crops. Frost mitigation is a little bit of an advantage on the other end of that. So if you are looking at different types of, there are advantages and disadvantages of all irrigation, but by far most of the technology and efficiencies in the world are in drip irrigation. Now, when I say that, you can get a number of different kinds of drip irrigation. And then when you do your design work, you will know how much soil capacity you have, and that will determine your emitter output, differences between the spaces in the emitters. You've got vine spacing to think about. A lot of people have trouble, so they put too wide a emitter spacing in when developing vineyards where they've got close plant spacing. So 2 of the plants in the row between the third one aren't getting any water. These are simple little things in vineyard establishment that people don't think about. So anyway, we go through to the design part. Right, so first of all, like we said, we're going to talk about soil surveying. Very important. I highly recommend you get a contractor in to take soil pits, or if you're handy on an excavator, you're probably in a 10-acre block, I'd dig 10 soil pits. And then there looks like there's some great new technology like the EM38 to have a look at soil. You have to understand that, because when you start doing soil irrigation design, you have to understand that some soils, they take water very easily, some hold water very easily, and sometimes water passes through. That will determine on how you're going to apply the water to those areas, okay? So all your design work and assessment of your site should be done prior to construction, okay? You also, this is the other part that catches people out, permits. Depends where you are, and you've also got to build a source of the water on the source of the water, which are your pump sheds. Now they could be in a riparian area, they could be on a water easement, irrigation easement, they could be in the town, or they could be in the RDOS. You're going to have to get permits to take water. You also have to watch about the hydro supply. I'm telling you now, you can get delays of up to 18 months for Fortis to come and connect power to your pump shed. So a lot of planning involved in what you're doing in irrigation construction. You could go to do the construction and suddenly you can't do anything because you haven't got permits, you haven't got your materials, etc. So there's a lot of planning that you have to do before you get into construction. For like I said, cost awareness, look for innovation. Now the world has gone a bit crazy here in the last couple of years. PVC prices have probably quadrupled. It's seriously terrible. 40 schedule 2-inch PVC has gone from 70 cents a foot to $2.50 a foot. All right, so it's going to be, you have to be very aware of your costs. So look for innovation. So there's products out on the market like HDPE, which is a high density poly product. They used to be about the double the price of PVC. It's now cheaper than PVC because they use a different resin. Well, people used to use HDPE because it's got low installation costs. So now HDPE has become a lot more popular than what PVC is. So just look for innovations in materials for when you're doing irrigation construction. Example of that too is like there's a lot of poly products out now that are replacing PVC as PVC replaced cast and brass. So there's been innovation over the years in irrigation technology. One of the biggest things is looking for products to save in labour in construction. The best example I can give you at the moment for that would be submain construction. A lot of people still cut and tee into PVC. Highly labour intensive, mistakes get made, much more chance that something's going to go terribly wrong in that submain because there's so many cuts and glues. Now you can get a grommet system that you can pre-drill into the hole, plug in a fitting that has a riser up to your drip. Installation alone is about 80% cheaper than say the old cut and tee method. So just be aware that there are, have a look around before you do your construction. People in the industry will be talking about new innovative things that are happening. So just be aware of those things. It can save you a lot of money. The labour and construction. So, like I said before, you can choose to do this yourself. You could do a hybrid construction thing. Say you've got people working for you, or you're doing it yourself. That you're happy gluing and cutting PVC up, or welding HDPE. You mightn't be so good on an excavator. You might have driven it for 50 hours but can't dig a hole. That kind of business. But yeah, have a look around, see what you can do. Same again, it's going to save you money if you can do your own labour in irrigation construction. Obviously, there's contractors and businesses out there that will give you the whole deal package. They'll dig the place up, lay your pipe, backfill, etc. So it's up to you as an individual how you do that. If you are going to do stuff yourself, I'll just plug the Irrigation Industry Association of British Columbia. They have some excellent courses for people to attend. They run the courses intermittently through the year. I think it's to do with the amount of people that sign up. A lot of the courses are in either Abbotsford or Kelowna. There's irrigation technician courses, and that's to do with landscaping and or vineyard construction. So you can become level 1, level 2 construction certified for construction, and then that's actually registered in a register. You can look up people that are in that register if you're hiring contractors. So that's a little bit of a handy thing. And then even you can go on in that industry, that area, and do irrigation design. They also do that. So it's a great little thing there, the Irrigation Industry Association of BC. Think about your timing of your construction. What I mean by that is, depends on where you are at. If it's a brand new block, you got to think about, this is complementary to the vineyard that you're actually building. So you have to have plants in trellis. If you're going to put trellis in, wire, you have to have access with machinery. It's no good digging all the irrigation trenches 3 months before you're going to put the pipes in, because all of the sides of the walls of the trenches fall in. You have to get your shit together so you can, so it's efficient. And that you don't cause other issues in the development stage, or probably where you're going to do. A lot of vineyards at the moment, hopefully, are converting over to drip irrigation from overhead. So they time it so they're not in the middle of harvest, that they're not digging up their rows to put in trenches, to put in their submains for their drip, etc. So that's what I'm getting at about timing of construction. Obviously, you're not going to do that in Okanagan anywhere past probably the middle of October, and you're not going to be able to start probably in the middle of March most years, because A, either the ground's frozen, or B, you're in conditions that are not conducive to construction, as in too cold to glue pipe, things like that. So you just can't think you can go and do this in the wintertime. I have been on a project where owners decided that they wanted to glue in November, and I'm telling you, in spring, it blew itself to pieces. So just something to be aware of about construction. So you're trying to time it probably in that time period just before you're planting, or after planting, if you're confident that you can get it in. There's nothing worse than just planting 10,000 acres worth of vines and not having the irrigation available to you, because it takes a long time to water 1,800 plants an acre with a bucket. So just think about the timing of that. Parts lists, order early. Same again this time we're living in. Sometimes you just can't get parts. I know people have been waiting for VFDs, the variable frequency drives for pump systems, for nearly 2 years. So get in early, and so get your specification from your design off your designer, or if you design yourself, use diagrams of valve components, so you understand that you're not missing any of the parts, because there's nothing worse than getting into construction and then suddenly you've got a 6-week wait on components in your irrigation system that you can't substitute. So always I suppose I keep reiterating, planning is the key to a really good construction. And look for shop jobs. Now that sounds quite funny, but I tell you now, sitting in a trench, putting together a valve component or a valve assembly, it's a lot easier to do it in the shop. You got things like vices and nice clean. You're not sitting in the mud or the dust or the wind blowing or the sun or whatever. It's very nice to be sitting in a shop doing some of the components. Now you can pinpoint components in a system that you can do this with. It's usually valve assembly, so you're talking anywhere from the pressure regulator up to an air relief, over to your valve system, to a shut-off valve or something like that, and it's like a manifold. So you can build a lot of those in the shop. You can build a lot of things like drip components. Say that drip area where I was saying there's a grommet. You can build it's about 6 or 7 parts that go from the grommet up to the drip tape, and you can actually put those together in the shop too. Mind you, that part, be very mindful that you cut the length of that riser pipe to the right length, or dig the trench to suit it, because you get out in the field and it's too short or way too long, you waste a lot of time. And then construction day, make sure, like I said, make sure you're ready to do all this. Make sure you have all your equipment ready. Make sure that you have all your parts, pre-stack parts out in the field. Like you might have slings of 2-inch pipe that you might have had in, but try to put them closer to your trenches, somewhere where you can, it's a lot to do with labour costs. So anything you can reduce the labour costs in the construction phase is great. Like I said, don't do it in the cold. Glue doesn't do very well in the cold. Same with extreme heat. I don't know if you've ever tried to push together a 4 or 6-inch main with extreme heat. You've got about 1 second to get that fitting together, or it sticks together wrong, and then next time you turn it on, it'll blow out. So just have it, on the construction day, whether you make sure you got your staff there, contractors and things like that. Do not turn the system on for the first 24 hours. I just can't. People get so excited and they put things together and they turn them on and they think it's all good, but what's happened, the joint might have moved 2 or 3 inches under the ground, and probably a week later your system might blow to pieces. So just let everything cure. One of the things, if people are using HDPE versus PVC, it has a shrink expansion component to it. So if it's really hot day and you put in poly, what it can do is, I think the thing is about 1 foot every 100 feet, it will expand in the heat. It also shrinks that amount going the other way. So if you are putting in things like that, just be wary of the temperature. Some guys put that pipe in the ground and then leave it exposed a little bit at the ends and then cover it straight away so it doesn't move around too much. You could build your valve assembly on poly pipe and then suddenly it shifts 1 foot. It could be disastrous, but anyway. And then obviously you start it up. So if everything is going well, that won't happen. Say that good maintenance is good maintenance only if the system's been put together correctly. Maintenance programs, depending on what you've got, what needs to be maintained is a general maintenance system, pumps, filters, valves, drip irrigation. So we're very fortunate here in the valley that our water is pretty clean. That's out of the river or the channel systems, whatever. If you're on a well, that could be a little bit different. The main problems with water here is calcification. We don't have too much trouble with sediment unless it's at the start of the season where all the water is quite turbid. And then we also have algal issues in the middle of summer when the water gets quite warm, and you can have algal breakouts in your actual irrigation system. So There's maintenance programs for drip where you can just flush with higher volume water. That's by opening the end of your tapes, and you can flush sediment out. You can use chemicals to help with that process with hard material and help clean you, keep your drip clean, the inside of the orifices in the drip themselves. And then that's sediment, and then you can get algal blooms as well. So they use, they used to use hypo, like chlorine-based materials. They use a bit environmentally friendly stuff now, which you can get at any of your local irrigation supplies. So usually once a year, or maybe even here because it's not so dirty, a couple of years, but we run a maintenance program on our drip, and I think we flush about once a year just for sediment, things like that. So your pumps should be serviced quite often because of if they get out, you can lose bearings, get loose, things like that, impeller damage, etc., and they become inefficient, cost you money. And if the pump goes, obviously it'll cost you more money, or it could cost you a crop if it's in the middle of the growing season. So make sure you have a maintenance program on all your pumps. Filtration, the amount of times that you actually play with filters is usually determined on how dirty the water is. The dirtier the water, obviously, the quicker the filters block up. If you're lucky enough to spend a lot of money on automated filtration, they still need to be maintained. They should be checked regularly. We find very good if you have pressure gauges on the in and outside of filters, and it saves you pulling the filters apart all the time just for checking them. So you get a pressure differentiation across a filter of about 2 to 3 psi usually, but if it's dirty, it could be showing something like 10 to 20. If you're unlucky, it could be showing 60, and you might have a picture of what I just showed you just before. But yeah, so those kind of things. And valves, same as anything, they wear. You got a system, usually got diaphragms inside valves that may wear. You can get sediment. If sediment does get through the filtration system, say had a line break in a submain or something, rocks can get jammed in your valves. That includes the pressure regulators as well. So yeah, it's just very good to have a good maintenance system. So like I said, if you buy a filter, some kind of filter, most of the manuals have really good maintenance schedules involved with them. Same with the pumps. And then generally drip irrigation, there's a lot of information online. I come from one of the places in the world where irrigation innovation is amazing, and so is Israel and California, and that's because we have no water. And they've done a very good job in innovating everything to do with irrigation. So, and then moving on to what Christopher was saying, monitoring the system for performance. Keep records, absolutely. Talking about low, you can soil moisture, you can use your soil moisture charts to see, same irrigation. You can roughly see what kind of water output's going. If it's suddenly not working, it could be as simple as the emitter above your soil moisture meter is blocked, which is disastrous, but and very unlucky. But things like the simple one is, when I first started automating vineyards, when we went from manual, from the shovel digging in the hole, shoveling plants underneath, just looking for tips, we started automating the irrigation system, and it was a bit hard to trust. You come back in the morning and the irrigation controller said you'd rolled through the whole irrigation, but unbeknownst, you didn't know that there was a lightning strike just down the road. Cut the pump out, but the irrigation controller kept rolling through and told you that it watered everything. Okay, and so the trust wasn't there in some time. So a simple thing we used to do, and this a bit of recycling, we used to cut up the drums. So say an old Roundup drum, we used to cut them in half, go out and measure 4 hours of water in them, mark it in the inside with a permanent marker, and that could be at the end of your irrigation zone, and driving around with your coffee in the morning and just look to see if the water's in the bucket. There's something so rudimentary, or not much technology in that you can check and that's a simple check that your irrigation system is working. Obviously it is changing for agriculture, usually around the world. We are going to start metered. We will be metered here in Okanagan pretty soon. There you can see the movement. They've moved through the town, they've moved through industry, and now the next part will be they'll be monitoring. They'll say you'll put you on a trial for monitoring water in agriculture, and then next minute we'll be paying for the water. So very important about all the, Amy and Christopher said that irrigation is going to become more expensive for sure, and the better your system, the more efficient your system is going to be, the more money it's going to save you as a grower. And obviously the benefits towards the environment and the sustainability part is far outweighs, the old ways of flood irrigating are far gone. So, and then, like I said, record all maintenance, and these are, some horror pictures, but this is what happens. And I think that's about it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Amy. That was a lot of information to take in, but I think a really well-rounded kind of presentation of the breadth of what we're looking at here in terms of water efficiency. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of bring each of you in. Amy, maybe we can get you on video again. And we're going to just open this up to a Q&A. There are a few people who have put some questions in the chat box. So thanks to you, those who have some questions. Also, I'd invite any of you who have any questions to just go ahead and raise your hand, and you can chime in and ask questions directly of any of the presenters here. Myself included, I guess, if you have questions about the SWBC program, or just ask generally. And we've got the knowledge bank here, I'm sure, to do justice to your question. So I'm actually going to go ahead and just get started by asking one of the questions that's in our chat. And I'm going to let you guys just field this as you may, our presenters. So the question is, what about some of the other sustainability principles that may require more water than the minimum advocated here? For instance, soil health and regeneration, carbon sequestration, cover crop contribution to nutrition and increased water retention, GHG reduction, long-term sustained yield, reduced nitrogen inputs, etc. Any of you feel inclined to take that one on?
There's nothing wrong with how much you want to water, or it depends on what crop you've got or what you want to achieve. If you're watering, like I said, mid-rows, you invest in overhead irrigation and just, water responsibly, water at night time, things like that for your overhead, for your middle row. It's to do with, it's not a thing of reducing water to the point where you can't achieve what you want to achieve. I would say that we're pushing for, grapevines don't use very much water in an agricultural sense. But understandably, you need to grow biodiversity, etc. underneath the vine, you might need extra water, and there's no part of that. It doesn't mean you still can't be efficient. It doesn't mean you can still not measure that amount of water that you're using. And it still doesn't mean that you're putting in inefficient irrigation design. So, like I said, have at it if you're going to use the water.
And maybe part of that monitoring then is just like seeing that progress over time. If you have some goals, for instance, in increasing soil health and, really creating a robust cover crop for a certain amount of time, to kind of reach those goals, using the water you need for that, tapering it back off, like, always kind of doing that dance of I think what you've all mentioned is the key is just kind of really knowing what you need and being very precise about using it.
Yeah, it's intentionality, right? Like I completely agree with what you said there, Andrew, because it's where, the goal is not just reduce everything, right? It's not eliminate, whether we're talking about SWBC, regen, organic, or your own kind of approach, it's doing things with intentionality, context to your site that create a more robust ecosystem, more robust wines, better quality fruit. And so it's vines have originated, you go back thousands of years, they're usually on not very fertile sites. Like Andrew said, you don't need much water. And so a lot of those reductions are coming in what we're needing to give the vine and knowing when to give it water, when not to. But if there's other things you're wanting to, and we also see good data on when you use deficit, when you reduce water, it increases mycorrhizae, you actually get more soil health typically. Over irrigation will do the opposite, it harms soil health. So, but if you want it, it's not just always use less, it's use the water where you need it. Some places that's going to be more, and exactly like Andrew said.
I think the only other thing I would have to add to that discussion is, we're in the Okanagan, we're certainly at a disadvantage compared to other wine growing regions in the world because of agriculture. So if I were in California, for example, you'd establish a cover crop in fall and have the winter and it would be supported by winter rainfall and mild conditions. And then, you get to spring and you till it in or you mow it down. We need that not only do we need water for our vines, but we do need a little bit of extra to support any sort of cover crop because it's going to have to be irrigated through the spring, unless it's this year where it really hasn't stopped. So I don't think it's not looking at just completely removing that from the equation because that's just not possible because of the weather conditions we have here. But like you said, Chris and Andrew, but doing it with intention. Do you need a big juicy cover crop supported by overhead irrigation all through summer months? Probably not. But can you establish one in spring and gradually let it die off through the summer and use that water judiciously? I think that why wouldn't you?
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you. I've got another question here in the chat. It's not really a question, it's a curiosity about deep soil irrigation. I'm curious about deep soil irrigation. Hugh, can you be a little bit more specific about that maybe for our presenters?
Oh, hi, sorry.
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Can do, yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry, deep soil is probably the wrong way to put it. I was just asking more about irrigation systems that would deliver water to precise locations subsoil. So maybe you have a drip system with sort of down tubes that would allow the water to fall to a certain soil level. And maybe you would have a separate sort of micro sprayer system to irrigate a cover crop when you wanted to. I was just wondering, what is the possibility of separating out very precisely, I guess, the irrigation for the vines and the irrigation for the cover crop? And I don't know if that makes any sense.
And yeah, so a lot of the time people do that. If you're putting in a split, you usually put a split system in for overhead to drip, basically because of the water requirement or the volume requirement and pressure requirements are different for each system. So like overhead irrigation requires a lot more water volume at about 60 psi, and then your drip irrigation system requires a lot less volume. It hits the valves at about, it's hitting the valve at high pressure at probably 100, but you're reducing it down to 25, 30 psi. So people do separate irrigation systems. If you want to water, the depth of your irrigation is basically, it's more aimed at on your duration of your irrigation and your soil type. So each soil type has a different infiltration rate. Sand obviously has a really what they call a high infiltration rate. So water would move through sand at, say, a foot an hour. I'm just it could be way different to that, but and then clay could only be half a foot for half an hour. I mean, there's that kind of thing. So you're looking at infiltration rates, and you're looking at the length and time of your irrigation to reach depth. The depth part, I don't understand. If you water past your root system, usually they call that drainage. That means that you've watered past the available area for the plant to take that water, and it's actually wasted water. So if you're looking at depth watering, they used to do it in places that have got a lot of salt. They used to push salt down using long irrigation times and depths, and they'd push the salt down through the soil profile, and then as a couple of weeks went by, that salt would move itself up to the surface. But that was a use of deep watering. But obviously,
I think the word deep may have been a wrong word to use. It was more perhaps the idea that water
targeted
on, it's dripping on the undervine area, and you could have runoff. I mean, you could have a cover crop on the undervine area, like some white clover or something that would help it sink in. But like, as it gets very droughty here and the soil surface can develop a crust or whatever, like maybe the water being able to be delivered just subsurface, so that's more precise. But I don't know. I think I saw something where you had a regular drip line, and the drip emitters would deposit their water into a tube that went down into the soil a little bit. But maybe that's fantasy. I don't know.
I think I have seen that before, not on a large scale, but I've seen it proposed. I've worked a little bit with subsurface irrigation, and I dislike it because you just don't know if the amount of water that you require is actually going through the emitter. You can't see any breaks really until you start to see severe water stress of the vine. I don't see how you would have any issue getting your water to infiltrate and down at depth if you've got a really healthy soil at the surface, perhaps for some really heavy clays where you want to get it down deep, and you're having issues with it either infiltrating and spreading sort of horizontally instead of getting all that nice vertical movement. But if you do have an issue with crusting at the soil surface, then that's usually an indication that there's an issue with soil health at the surface. And addressing that would probably be more economical, both in the short and the long term, rather than installing a system like that. I have seen growers one grower in particular in Nampa successfully run an irrigation program through the season where it was really 2, maybe 3 really long, deep irrigations. But that was sort of built up over time, of gradually teaching the vine roots to just continue to go down to depth. And it's great if you can do it, then the vine's getting its water, and you're really minimizing evaporation because you've got all that water stored at depth, and you're encouraging the root system to really work hard and go deep. He would do that.
So here in the Okanagan, what do they do to encourage that? What is the practice here?
Well, I think it's just gradually over. For me, I have an opinion on this, but for me, it's you start with an established vineyard where you know that the vine's got a very small root system. That's obviously not going to be practical. You need to be there. You need a program of frequent short irrigations, but just gradually over time increasing the depth, reducing the length, using tools that Chris suggested to monitor vine water stress, and just kind of encouraging vines roots to explore down deeper through your irrigation program. So I guess it's a lifetime of training.
One thing I know they do, some of it's popular in Oregon and other areas is, and which elsewhere is ripping, obviously, right? So you're trying to stop that lateral exploration. Obviously, that's controversial at times, but kind of the idea is that if you're destroying the lateral exploration, you're going to force roots to then go deeper. The other thing, just quickly on the subsurface, I would say the challenge, I think, to exactly what Andrew and Amy were saying, is the it's maintenance based on water. Like the only real primary benefit is water savings, unless you have really terrible soil infiltration. And maintenance is a lot more expensive. They used to have underground systems that were actually those were a nightmare. Now you have those different types of tubes. There's been some cool data, but the problem is how much are you saving versus now irrigation? And I think something really Andrew talked about is like, how do you know it's actually working, which is the challenge with some of this tech. You can't, it's harder to see. And so I think we're seeing more of it. I don't think the data is there quite yet, in my opinion.
So in preparation,
I was going to say on the stage, they say 20 years ago, 15 years ago, started the movement towards drip irrigation as a whole. Out there, a number of blocks died before we realised what we were doing out there. So what we worked out in the end was when we are converting overhead irrigation to drip irrigation, especially on sand, the root area on an 8x4 8x4 spacing out on the Black Sage, which was quite historical. You would find that most of the root system was in the top couple of inches of the sand.
Yep.
And it was also across the 8x4 square between the vine. So it took up the whole surface area around the vine and into the mid-row. And it also was only very, very shallow. It made it very susceptible to heat or environmental change, so cold and heat. There was a lot of vine kill at that stage out there because the root systems were so shallow. They'd be damaged in the wintertime. And then also you have a 45-degree day, and I think this is where some of the fallacy of the overhead irrigation, they used to turn it on to make the vines look better. They were actually suffering in that 45 degrees because their root system was so close to the surface. And then suddenly they'd turn the irrigation on, put the vine into a total dreamland that opened up all its stomata and starts operating at 45 degrees under this rain. But so what we used to do was we left the overhead irrigation in place. We watered once with that, then we used drip irrigation to push down deep and then train the root systems down. And now that takes a couple of seasons. We found that the vine lost 80% of the root mass in the outer row until it got to about that 20% area underneath the vine. And then with trained irrigations, that root system moved downward in the sand. And, some of the Cab Franc out there has got 3 to 4 feet down minimum of root system. So it takes a little time. You'll kill your vineyard if you convert straight from overhead to drip because of the root system, the way it's the physiology of the root system will change dramatically. That precision viticulture, or the precision of placing the water, very, very good point, but you have to be very careful because some of those plants are used to how they used to be watered. So.
Great. And there's a comment here, I think along the same lines, it's saying tile drainage is used for subsurface irrigation in some areas. Is that, I actually don't know what that means, but
maybe in Ontario, I don't know.
Okay.
We don't have those. We don't have
on the island.
Yeah,
there's some.
We don't have the soils here.
Yeah.
Okay. Our next question. In all the monitoring tools, pressure bomb, probes, mapping that has been presented, what is the combo that seems to be the most precise and applicable in a day-to-day at full season?
If I jump in here first, my thought is you're starting with the pressure bomb. The challenge with the pressure bomb is it's time consuming. You need to do it regularly, especially if you're doing it at midday. Pressure bombs aren't very expensive. They're very simple to use. But if you're doing it at midday, you need to be doing it pretty regularly, at minimum once a week, but probably more. And if you have a bunch of vineyards, you've got your vineyards very heterogeneous, lots of variability. You kind of need to hit those different sites. To me, and this is just my personal opinion, the soil moisture sensors I go back and forth on, because just because your soil moisture is changing doesn't mean that has any effect on vine water status. You could see a huge drop in soil moisture, but actually your plant could still have lots of water. You know, the vine has amazing ways to pull water from that profile, from the mycorrhizae, from other elements of the soil. It can move water up and down the profile. So if you've got a deep-rooted plant, it has a lot of capacity to adjust water content. And so your soil moisture probe may not be capturing that. And if you're deep-rooted, like we have lots of clients, your water, you know, your vine is under a meter. Well, it's hard to get a soil moisture probe down there. And if you've got roots that are going a meter plus, but it's also simple. So my answer is soil pits. I mean, I think the soil mapping, it's doing some sort of soil mapping in soil pits, and then maybe combined with the pressure bomb is the best current method. And one of the things we're trying to figure out, and I think, you know, Sarah is a great person to talk to about this, is are there better methods that are a bit less time intensive? And so we don't have an answer for that yet, but we're hoping to have one soon.
Cool. Great answer. Thanks.
I am very curious, Andrew and Amy, what your thoughts, answers to that would be.
A combination of one soil moisture sensor. I've kind of fluctuated between capacitance and tensiometers, and one of my favorites has just been an old school gypsum blocks. As long as, you know, they're not getting, the wires aren't getting gnawed by coyotes or rabbits. They just, I think you said it in your presentation, Chris, they don't need to be calibrated. It's just a pure tension of the soil water. So it just gives you that direct result that you can compare, and really easy to compare with existing data or between sites, and between different sites on a single block, where you don't have to calibrate to soil type. But in combination with that, just a little shovel. So you can get out there and either a backhoe or a shovel.
Yeah, one of the best investments are those little like narrow shovels with the little handle on them,
Yeah.
only a couple of foot high. You just dig under the vine. Yeah, so I was a bit, so tensiometers and gypsum blocks. I'm a great fan of them, especially in young vineyards. The tensiometer and the gypsum block have ranges in pressure that they measure in the soil. Very, very conducive to growing young vines that don't need much. You don't want big wilt going anywhere near a wilt point. So, you know, that 0 to 60 kPa or, you know, that round there, and you're growing beautiful young vines. It's a great tool, and they, you know, the range of a gypsum block is a bit bigger than a tensiometer, but you know, tensiometers, you can get them to measure to 100 kPa or 1 to, you know, 10 to 150 or something, and they're great for growing young vines. Okay, and they're cheap. You can put them in everywhere, and it really they're really great. I think they've even got automated tensiometers now, but not like the days you used to go around and measure them all and things like that. And then I've moved to capacitance probes just for general soil. But people have to understand that every single site is different. Okay, with capacitance probes and things, we see people comparing site to site. That does not work with soil moisture. It's historical data for that site. Another thing is you have to be very careful with like things like capacitance probes. How they've been installed is very important as well. They get a lot of what I call blank spots in them. And after a while of reading capacitance probes data, you can sometimes see that they mightn't have been installed properly. A lot of people use things like when they drill a hole or drilling the hole's bags, you're smearing all the outside of the hole and things like that. But they use things like kaolinite and some kind of medium to get the touch or the feel of the soil around the capacitance probe. It's a good question. I think it's personal choice. How you like to read things, how automated they are. So I think it's more of a personal choice. But yeah, I'm a bit of a fan of the old gypsum block, and the tensiometer. So there with Amy.
What I would say is kind of the trade-off is with the soil, with the capacitance, is you need to go figure out what your soil moisture curve is. You need to do a bit of that work, versus the challenge with gypsum and tensiometers is they're a lot more maintenance intensive. And that, I would say, in our experience, has been, we're more hesitant there, as they do if you're experienced and you've got the knowledge, they're great, but they do take more work. And so it's kind of a trade-off there.
I'm going to throw in here, I think, another comment related, which is that leaf temperature, ambient temperature differential has potential as a simple, inexpensive decision-making tool. Okay, I'm going to move to the next question. Are there any good resources to keep up with new irrigation technology so we don't get stuck in our ways with excessive teas?
That's a really good question. I'd like to know what other people's answer to that is, to be honest. California or Australia, I know that I had in the past regularly attended conferences and symposium wherever I could, and those two industries certainly did a good job of that sort of research to practice kind of communication. But since we've kind of been doing things over Zoom, I still haven't found my own way to get that information, apart from the excellent so the Thursdays, every third Thursday, the Summerland Research Centre presentations. So yeah, if anybody else has more suggestions, then I'd appreciate that too.
One of the ways you can do it, so if you start, we've got some great irrigation supply places in the valley, and I'm not going to push any single one of them, but there are some really good design guys there, and I've worked with them a number of times, and they're trying to sell product here, but there's also some great information there. So the retailers, taking that with a grain of salt, obviously don't, whatever, go in there and expect them not to try to sell you anything. Most of the viticultural magazines around the world have a lot of ads and things. So if you have a look, and then just the major brands of some of the irrigation components, Amiad, Netafim, things like that. If you go, they've got great web pages that have and it's amazing, some of the technology that's around the world. And I'm not guaranteeing that you're not going to be able to get it in Canada. You're not going to be able to get it in Canada yet, but there's some amazing technology and innovation happening in irrigation systems, especially in automated filter control, things like that. VFDs are getting cheaper for pump control, things like that. So just have a look around. The internet's a wonderful place. Good old Google does a lot of things too. So,
Yeah.
No,
go ahead.
I was going to ask Andrew, you also mentioned the Irrigation Industry Association of BC. Would they be a really good resource for keeping up to date with kind of new technologies?
Yeah, and their web page has a resource page as well. So that's a good point, and you can go in there, and I'm sure, if you talk to those guys, technologies, it's bad to say, but because there's so much water in Canada, the technology of irrigation hasn't moved here as rapidly as other places, but there is that technology around, and just to the south of, especially in California, it's probably some of the best irrigation innovation in the world. Most of the irrigation companies do come from Israel, and so it's amazing. So Irrigators Association of BC. Some of the bigger companies here that have bought in some of the technology, and then I will plug Herman Barahona down at Southern Irrigation in Oliver. They've got a number of stores everywhere, Lower Mainland as well. Because he came from Chile, they're great innovators in irrigation as well, and he's very open to using new ideas in his designs. You can have a chat to him. He's very knowledgeable in new technology that's coming into the valley.
Great.
Yeah, I would say, less on the specific irrigation side, like with what Andrew's talking about in terms of like actual irrigation components to design, but extensions. If you can find, you know, the Oregon State has an extension. There's lots in California. If you just look those up, I mean, I do that. We have a newsletter, so at a broader level, you can free subscribe to the newsletter. We'll share resources like that I find. So if we've shared stuff on subsurface irrigation, stuff like that. You can just sign up at our website, and that just we'll share that. But I think extensions are really good, and I think Google Scholar is a great way because you'll find reviews, and that's where I wanted to share those two papers, because they do a review of kind of the current status of all the technology. And to Andrew's point, you always got to be careful of bias with those two papers. It's by one of the Fruition Science co-founders. And so he's a very big fan of sat flow. So obviously the paper is very positive on sat flow sensors, but whatever, he gives good data on these different technologies and kind of where they're at, how they're being used. And so I think just checking Google Scholar every once in a while also can be beneficial.
Great. Well, we have a few more questions in the chat and we're running close to time. So I think I'll just take one more here and then maybe we can do these on the rapid fire answer. Do you need to adjust any above ground management, i.e. pruning crop load when shifting irrigation type? That's
an easy yes.
All right, that was rapid fire. I love it. Let's go to our last question then. In preparing a vineyard on clay soils, does it make sense to just rip the vineyard rows to help water to penetrate more evenly?
100% rip.
And I say not down the vineyard rows. If it's a field that's free of any sort of trellis infrastructure, rip down the rows, rip across the rows, and rip diagonally. And if you can, incorporate any sort of amendments that you need to adjust your soil, including compost. Do all of the things that you can afford, because that is your opportunity to get the soil ready for planting. In the next 30 years that you have your vineyard, you won't get that opportunity again. So do all of the things.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Yeah, and absolutely, I completely agree with both. And I think recognize you're going to be disturbing the soil biome. You are having a negative effect in that sense. But so knowing what the status of the site was before. I mean, obviously a lot of sites right now that we're planting on were farmed very conventionally, maybe an orchard. And guess what? They just dump down tons of NPK. So you don't have to be as worried because there isn't going to be much soil life there anyway. So knowing that versus maybe it was a site that was a bit more natural, you're going to be disturbing that. And that's where I think some of the regen stuff becomes interesting, where they recommend even just dripping some fulvic costs you nothing. Doing what Amy says, you throw down a bit of fulvic, things like that, that hopefully will help sustain that biome, so that even though you are disturbing it, you're minimizing that disturbance. So on compost, compost will do that. It helps as well, but I think like a fulvic is another component.
I think they said it was clay, so I was just saying yes, and definitely ameliorants are in for clay soils. You'll have soil acidicity issues, things like that down the track if you don't rip clay soils. You'd be probably using gypsum, things like that in those situations. So, yeah.
And just when you're ripping, how do you deliver at depth? Applying the amendments with the ripping, you just like place it on the surface and rip over it. Yes.
Yep.
Some rip a tine, so you can either rip straight. When I say rip straight, the tine's straight in design, or you can have. There's a funny thing in viticulture called a duck foot ripper. There was a lot of studies done on shape of tines for ripping vineyards. The difference being that the straight rippers just basically break up the soil at depth, and then the winged rippers change the soil profile, as in they turn the soil profile over, so you're actually bringing up like B and C horizon up into the A and O, whatever. But yeah, there's thousands of papers on whether that's good or bad versus cross ripping and row ripping. You can find hundreds of papers on that. But usually injection of things like you'd be injecting things like might be superphosphate. If it's low in phosphorus, you might be injecting lime for pH adjustment, sulfur for pH adjustment, and you might be injecting things like gypsum for clay breaking material, like a clay breaker, calcium carbonate. So, and they've got an injection line. There's a tubing down mounted on the back of the ripper tine. So it's kind of looks like a seeder, carries the material in it, and then it distributes the stuff at depth. And there's probably what, at 2 to 3 feet or something like that. It's very important to do that. If you put it on the surface, lime takes about, I think it's about, travels only at about 10 centimeters or 7 centimeters a year. From surface down. So if you're looking at a place from your soil tests at depth at 30, 40 centimeters where you need a pH adjustment, it's going to take years and years for a surface lime application to actually work. So, and when you do it once, you have to keep doing it through the years too. So yeah, there is equipment that you can put stuff to depth.
And that's just a quick comment on especially here with the degree of super alkaline soils, that we know that impacts micronutrient ability. And that's where I think sulfur or things that are going to lower your pH, I mean, obviously great time to do it. And I think, you know, we see good data on that, even temporarily impacting micronutrient availability. So, you know, I think it's a really good thing to do. Even if it's not permanent, even if, you know.
Right. All right. Andrew, Christopher, and Amy, wherever you went, thank you all so much for your presentations today, for sharing your knowledge, for being a part of the Q&A. Really appreciate it. Thanks everybody who's still on the line. Thanks for being with us. I'll direct you once again to the Sustainable Wine Growing BC website also for more information. And we'll sign off here. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks so much.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Everyone.